I'm just thrilled about our keynote panel today. Two truly incredible leaders who are joining us to share their insights and their perspective. So I won't do full long introductions because I want to make sure we get to hear from them. You can see their full bios on the keynote, on the forum registration site under speakers, but I will just do very quick introductions. So we have with us today two amazing leaders from the Children's Defense Fund, Mrs. Marian Wright Edelman, who is the founder and president emerita, and Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson, who is the president and CEO of the Children's Defense Fund. And so Mrs. Marian Wright Edelman was, again, the founder of this organization almost 50 years ago now, has just been an incredible leader of the Children's Defense Fund's work over time. And the Reverend Dr. Wilson joined the organization in December as now the second president of this organization, and an incredible new leader in this moment. And just the reason I'm so excited to hear from them is that at this incredibly challenging moment in our nation's history, as we're all grappling with the multiple pandemics of a public health crisis, the deep pain of racial violence being exposed more starkly than ever, I am so eager to learn from their perspective, from having been in this work and continuing to be in this work, fighting for children and for communities over the long sweep of history. So please join me in welcoming them with a huge virtual set of applause. We're so grateful that they were willing to join us today, and I'm just so excited to hear from them. So I wanted to start with a broad question, just to hear from each of you about what brought you to this work on behalf of children and communities and advocating for justice. So Mrs. Edelman, maybe we can start with you. What brought you to this work on behalf of children and communities and advocating for justice?
My childhood, the example of my parents in my small southern town in South Carolina, Bennettsville. And when people ask me why I do what I do, I say I do exactly what my parents did. When they saw a need, they tried to respond. My father was a minister. My mother was the best organizer I ever knew. She was a church organist and chief fundraiser. I remember from the youngest time when the first old man began to wander the streets, Reverend Reddick. He was a very distinguished looking old man. He was a minister and he had nowhere to go. And so my parents began a home for the aged across the street from our parsonage. My dad was a Baptist minister, my mother was a church organizer and organist. And she was the best organizer I've ever seen. And so when you say, why do you do what you do? I say, I do exactly what my parents did. It never occurred to me not to do it. When you see a need, you try to respond. And so they created the first Black home for the aged, which my brother continued after my parents died, and which his children continue now that he has passed. And so I do exactly what my parents did and I was taught to do. If you don't ask why somebody doesn't do something when you see a big need, ask what you can do and then do it. And my father was a minister and my mother was the best organizer I ever knew. And so I just am carrying on a family tradition. It never occurred to me not to do what I do.
That's amazing. Thank you, Mrs. Edelman. And Dr. Wilson, would you tell us a little bit about what brought you to this work on behalf of children and communities?
Yeah, thank you, Hantul, and thanks for this opportunity to be here. A very similar story, but a little bit of a different background. I say to folks all the time, I grew up in Dallas, Texas. I grew up watching my mother do a lot of the things that I'm doing now, but in a very different environment. So I grew up in the child of the 80s, in the city, primarily raised by my mother, and had not seen or known my father since I was 3 years old. I believe that he's still living, but I grew up in one of those single parent homes in the city, but in the South. But so part of what filled in the blanks of my development was the church community. So the Beth Eden Baptist Church, Union Missionary Baptist Church there in Dallas, Texas, and my mother engaged in that environment as a youth director, as the teacher in the Baptist Training Union, and later as a leader in community organizations like Toastmasters and American Business Women's Association and the Citizens Committee to Save Our Children. And so for me, by the time I began to discern a sense of call, of learning from history about how change happened, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer like Mrs. Edelman.
I
But
never
in
thought
my,
I wanted to be a lawyer.
when I got to college at Xavier University, after my first year, I began to discern a call to ministry. Not anything I wanted, quite frankly. I had two uncles who were ministers to disastrous personal effects in their personal lives. Not a path I wanted to go, not a path my mother wanted us to go because of the degree of the sacrifice. But I think there are ways in which seeing the struggle and the reality that I grew up in with her leadership, with her resilience and her guidance, and seeing the blanks of our family life filled in by church members and community members, and that group of folks who would always send me forth and not let me fail, is what led me to this work as a response to the pain and circumstances that we saw all around us. And for me, that had a critical and crystallizing effect in the murder of my brother when I was a teen. And so there's a way in which seeing the pain of young people and having experienced that in my own life, but also seeing community respond is what has driven me and kind of sent me forth into this work.
It's incredible to hear about both of your family influences and your parents in particular. So thank you both for sharing that. Dr. Wilson, just picking up on that, I'm wondering if you can tell us more about your work as both a faith and philanthropic leader in St. Louis, especially leading up to and during the Ferguson protests. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that work was?
No, I'm glad to do that. I came to St. Louis working with the United Way of Greater St. Louis in school. I came to negotiate my sense of call and the fact that I didn't want to do it with this interest in political science and government by deciding I would go into nonprofit management. Began working with United Way. That brought me to the city of St. Louis. But what came with me was that call and desire to serve young people. And so I served bivocationally as a youth pastor at a congregation while I was raising funds through the United Way. That ministry and interest and that combination, quite frankly, led me along a path where up until 2 years ago, I always had two jobs. So leading up to the Ferguson uprising, I was both the president and CEO of the Deaconess Foundation, a church-related health conversion that provided grants to organizations that serve, advocate, and mobilize and build power on behalf of children. But I was also the pastor of St. John's Church, the Beloved Community, an inner-city, interracial congregation related to the United Church of Christ, where we were teaching and preaching beloved community, trying to invite people to live across socioeconomic lines, serve as much in our congregation, the unhoused folk who slept on the parsonage steps, the old parsonage steps, to serving those people in the congregation who were teaching at local universities. And so in that work, we felt a sense of calling forth in the moment of the Ferguson uprising on August 9th, 2014, to use everything we had to be able to respond to the pain of an 18-year-old boy. So to be very clear about how it connects to this work, when I saw an 18-year-old Michael Brown lying in the middle of the street, lying in a pool of his own life force, what it connected with for me was sitting through the trial of the people who murdered my brother and seeing the picture of him laying in the same way. And that community violence and police violence connected for me in ways that I've had to deploy everything I had to respond. And some of that, the very first phases of that had to do with opening up the church as a space for organizing and mobilizing and deploying resources from the foundation to respond to the calls that young people were making in the streets for us to do this whole thing over again.
Thank you for sharing that. Those deeply painful but powerful moments too. Mrs. Edelman, you began your career in the civil rights movement. Can you tell us a little bit more about what led you from that work around civil rights to then founding the Children's Defense Fund?
I've never had a career. I've always had a mission. Everything that I have done comes out of my segregated childhood. I can never stand to see any child excluded from anything. And I was a rebel from the time I was 4 years old, when I would secretly switch to black and white signs at the water fountain at the Belks department store. And I never lost a chance to screw up the thing and to make sure, because my parents are very clear that every child was sacred and that segregation was wrong. And secondly, they had a very clear message that if you see a need, don't ask why doesn't somebody do something, ask why you don't need it. Do something. And I remember now, old, distinguished, well-educated Reverend Reddick was the first person I now know in retrospect had Alzheimer's. He began to wander the streets. And my parents began, my daddy was a minister, my mother was the best organizer in the church organist, but they began a home for the aged across from the street, across from our church. And all of us children had to go cook and clean and help out. But that's how we learned that it was our responsibility to take care of people who couldn't take care of themselves. And my nieces and nephews and my brother who passed, they still run that home for the aged behind our church in Venice,ville, South Carolina. And so that if I do what I was, it's just second nature. That when you see something that needs to be done, and and the belief that services around everybody pays for living, that you do it. And everything that they touched, and my mother was a brilliant organizer, it still existed. The home for the aged. I had 12 foster sisters and brothers. But my brother carries on the home for the aged now today. And so I just do what my parents did and my community parents did.
You talk about your parents built something that obviously lasted so enduringly, and you yourself have done that, Mrs. Edelman. Is there anything you want to share with us about sort of what you were thinking as you founded the Children's Defense Fund and wanted to make sure it was an organization that lasted?
The bottom line is that you follow the need. I went off to Spelman College, and that was a very restricted college for women. They were making us nice, polite, tea-pouring ladies. We had to go off in groups of threes. We had to have white gloves on Sundays in chapel. And after growing up in a segregated small town, I wasn't very good in sort of staying within Spelman's boundaries, but there was this wonderful man named Charles Merrill, who was the son of the Merrill Lynch. But he discovered Morehouse Men, which is the brother school across the street from Spelman College in Atlanta. And he wanted to come home after the army to find this Dr. Benjamin E. Mays that they all talked about. And he became chairman of the Spelman board. And my parents made me go off to Spelman because my father died. My mother made me go off to Spelman because it was a safe women's tea pouring school, but where I also had people who would watch over me. But I then, when Charles Merrill, who's a shy man, whose father was a Merrill Lynch, had seen all these Morehouse men who were so confident in the Army. And he went and found Dr. Benjamin E. Mays, who was the president of Morehouse College, and he set up a Merrill Scholarship program to study abroad. And Lord of mercy, I got outside of the be at home. You had to go off in groups of threes at Spelman and be home by 5:30 in that dormitory. And I woke up in my junior year and I was free, and Howard Zinn was my favorite professor at Spelman. And he insisted when I got my Merrill Fellowship to study abroad that I not go with the Sweetbriar group or the Smith group, that I go on my own. And Lord, was it wonderful being 18 and a half and 19 and a half and waking up in Paris and in Geneva, Switzerland, and being able to make your own decisions. And I saved my money and went to the Soviet Union the second year with a Lyle Fellowship the second summer. And it changed my life. And this shy man named Charles Merrill was the reason I was able to do that year abroad. And so it was, I do exactly what my parents did in my childhood. When we didn't know about Alzheimer's, so they started Home for the Aged. My brother carries that on, and when he died 2 years ago, his children carry it on. And so service is the rent that we pay for living. It's the message of my family. And to those of us who have an obligation to share. If you don't like the way the world is, you change it and make it better. And I'm very grateful for these childhood groundings that guide my life.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that, Mrs. Edelman. Dr. Wilson, I know you have described the Children's Defense Fund as an institution that bridges from movement to movement. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what that phrase means to you, and sort of what meaning and power we can derive from it.
Yeah, I think the call for us always is to ask how we responded to the moment and what have we done in the moment that will last beyond it. And the eve of Martin Luther King Day is helpful for us to be thoughtful about his call about revolution in this sense that we're called to a radical revolution of values and that we can revolt and transform people or change a moment, or we can have a true revolution and transform institutions. And that's the call, right? And so what I remember is that Reverend James Lawson, great teacher of nonviolent direct action organizing, who I've had the chance through the Children's Defense Fund to spend time with over the course of the last number of years, talks about the nonviolent movement of America. He did this at John Lewis's funeral last year. Talked about the nonviolent movement of America as existing from 1953 to 1973. There's a generation-long transformation of what it means to be American. I think it's actually no incident of history that in 1973, Mrs. Edelman founded the Children's Defense Fund, that it becomes an extension of what was embodied in the context of that movement and an example of the call to a revolutionary moment like the one that we find ourselves in right now. What are we building now that will last and bridge to the next? This is also personal to me because I now live, I literally live 4 blocks from the place where I met Mrs. Edelman for the first time in Brooklyn, DC. I came for a convening in the midst of the Ferguson uprising. One of the things I understood to be my responsibility and what we did through the foundation was to invite and precipitate young people telling their story to the rest of the nation. So I sponsored a delegation of 10 young people to come to Washington, DC for the Sojourner Summit to tell their story of what was happening on the ground to faith leaders from across the country. And at that summit, I reconnected with the late Dr. C.T. Vivian. And Dr. Vivian beckoned for me after I moderated this panel. He beckoned for me to come and sit with him. And for the record, when you get connected to the civil rights icon, you don't let him go. So he beckoned for me to sit with him in the morning. And I sat there all day to the afternoon. I sat with him and I learned as much as I could. I leaned in as much as I could. And at the end of the day in the afternoon, the dialogical keynote was with Marian Wright Edelman. And after the conversation and the keynote, he went up to speak with her and to greet her. And they hugged each other and then they leaned back and then they hugged each other again. And then they leaned back. And she, as you can see, she sometimes talks with her hands. She said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, nothing, I'm just here." She said, "Let's go get fish." And he turned around in the hospitality and heart of a preacher and said to everybody at our table, "Let's go get fish." And we ended up going to dinner. And so for me, it is very personal as well, not just that this CDF was founded in a moment that extends the civil rights movement, but it found me in the midst of the movement for Black lives in the earliest days. So this was 2005. In those earliest days of the mobilization still in Ferguson and the mobilizations across the country that are grown out of that, that's what connected me and helped to inform the work we began to do to plant freedom schools with the CDF model based on the Freedom Summer movement in the St. Louis region, and to grow our relationship through religious organizing at Alex Haley Farm in Clinton, Tennessee, and to learn nonviolent direct action organizing and bring people to that place to do it. And so that's what I mean, that literally CDF was founded as an extension of the civil rights movement and its work, and it is transitioning in the midst of this movement and informing in many ways the movement for Black lives. I'll tell one quick story that's not mine, but I heard it just earlier this week. A dear sister who was on that first Freedom Ride to Ferguson that we hosted at St. John's by the name of Tanisha McHarris, who works in philanthropy. We were co-conspiring on a project earlier this week. And she told me the story that she had been trained as a servant leader intern in freedom schools coming up in New York, that she had led a freedom school and that her work in the movement has in many ways been informed by CDF's work and training of her as a college student, so much so that when they came to do one of the early national convenings of the movement for Black lives, they didn't have a sense that so many people were going to bring kids. But what happened? Immediately, all the people who had been trained by the Children's Defense Fund as servant leader interns leading freedom schools began to gather together and sing the songs and do the chants that they learned at Alex Haley Farm for the freedom schools in the midst of the movement for Black lives. So here we are transitioning, but also carrying forth the DNA, because this is the deal. Oppression learns from oppression, right? Domination learns from domination. So movements of liberation have to learn from one another as well. And so I'm grateful that the movement of liberation that Ms. Edelman was so heartily a part of in the 1960s lives forth to inform the movement for liberation that's transforming our streets right now.
Yeah, that is just so powerful to think about how we can learn from those who came before us. And as you said, because the other side is doing that, and so we have to do it too to create something better for our children. I just want to remind folks, as we've reminded folks in the chat as well, that we will turn to audience Q&A in a few minutes. So please feel free to drop your questions into poll everywhere, or to vote up or down, or not down, vote up on anyone else's questions that they've submitted too. And I'll turn to those audience questions in just a minute. But before we do that, I'm wondering, I think this moment feels so challenging for many of us, but particularly challenging for our children, especially our children of color and those from historically underserved communities. And again, the sort of multiple pandemics that are happening right now in our nation, not just the coronavirus public health crisis, but also the ongoing epidemic of police violence and the ways in which structural racism shape the lives of our children so deeply in ways that you've both powerfully spoken to already. This moment just feels so challenging for all of us. I'm wondering, how would you urge, and yet as challenging as it feels for all of us, I think even more challenging for our children. And so that need to stay strong in this work and to fight even harder for our children, I think feels particularly important. I'm wondering, what would you urge our audience of education leaders to stay focused on? And what are you most focused on? What gives you hope in this moment? So Mrs. Edelman, maybe we can start with you. What would you urge our audience to focus on, and what gives you hope in this moment?
Well, we've created a range of models, and I think that we bought Alex Haley's farm about 30 years ago. And beauty matters, and it's a beautiful place. I didn't do my homework about this. I assumed it was Alex Haley. It was an all Black county or a largely Black county. It turned out to be a largely white county that was the most violent school desegregation district in the country. But it's beautiful. And we have the only two Maya Lin designed buildings, and beauty is very important for children, and to know that they are important. And we've created the models of freedom schools on the ground so that, and churches can come in that beautiful Maya Lin designed chapel, which is a Noah's Ark, of safety. And even though this is in an area of all white, mostly white county, where it was the most violent school desegregation district, Little Rock overshadowed it. We have built this place in the middle of one of the most violent places in our historic effort to desegregate schools. But I think it's our most important work. And beauty matters for the poor. We've trained thousands and thousands of people there. And you cannot build movements without investing in seeding folk in the faith community, women, young people, and people of color, and who are the people who are being oppressed. And I think that Haley Farm has been our most important work in many ways. The policy diaspora goes on, and we keep our policy work going, but there are servant leaders out there who understand that you got to make sure that stuff hits the ground and is carried through, and who understands that whoever controls the budget and the policy, which we do in Washington, controls the outcomes of lots of things. And so we tried to put all the pieces of transforming change in place, and to take risk and to maintain an independent voice for children. It turns out, I learned a lot from moving into this place, because it never occurred to me Alex Haley would buy a farm, a 150-acre farm in an all-white county. It was the most violent place beyond Little Rock that we had in the school desegregation efforts. But I think, it works. And the point is that I think that one has to put all the pieces of a complicated puzzle of transformation together. You've got to do the policy at the federal and state and local level, and whoever controls the budget controls the policy, and you got to pay attention to the nitty-gritty of the budget process, and then you've got to train those folk who are most affected by the problems to be engaged and to have voice. And so that I think that trying to put all these pieces together has made a difference, and there are many, many laws on the books that have helped many, many, many millions of children and people across race and across class. And I just feel very grateful that we've been able to serve in this way.
That's beautiful, Mrs. Edelman, the different aspects of sort of everything from that policy discussion and something that can feel as abstract as budgets to the really tangible and tactical work of training the next generation of leaders. I love that. Dr. Wilson, the same question to you. What would you urge our audience of education leaders to stay focused on, and what gives you hope in this moment? What are you most focused on as you're leading CDF into the future?
Yeah, I try to remind people that you can't transform the situation of all children if you're not willing to serve each child. And you can't serve each child if there's not one child that makes your heart leap. Right? I say this to say we like to focus on the macro and the justice issues. We build movements to send people forth to transform systems. And that can only be informed by proximity to children where they are meeting their needs, right? So we can't get to this societal transformation that is required, the transformation of systems, the mitigation of social determinants of health and inequity, unless we start with a direct service impact and touch on each child. I'm very intentional to make the difference between all and each. Because without making that universal to specific, or that universal to individual leap, we actually do not affirm approaches to equity. Of the 74 million children in America, in 2020 became the first year that of the 74 children under the age of 18 in America, the majority of them are children of color. You begin to think about youth, you've got another 30 million under the age of 25. Those 105 or so million young people are the most diverse generation in American history. One cannot speak of child well-being, one cannot speak of youth without speaking of race and racial justice. One must speak of equity when we speak of child well-being, right? So when we start talking about each child, then we're talking about service, and we're talking about contact, and we're talking about seeing them rather than a universal. But then finally, I don't think you can effectively serve, and I know I'm talking to educators, so I don't have to say this, but I'm practicing preaching for somebody else. You can't serve children if you don't love one child. So to get to your question, Hansu, what should you focus on in a moment this difficult? Focus on the face of the child that makes your heart leap.
And may I just build on Starsky's preaching?
Please.
The baby in the middle of the table. But you then have to look at the hard ways in which the systems work.
Yes.
Whoever controls the budget and the money controls the policy. And what CDF has tried to do is to keep that baby in the middle of the table, but to look at the budget process, and it's so dull. It's so technical, okay? But you just have to have the discipline to do that. And so we do our children's defense budget, and then we say how we waste all this money in the Defense Department and on the rich and on the tax cuts. But you got to do the technical, dull work. And whoever controls the budget at the federal, state, and local levels controls the policy. At the same time as you have to really try to talk about leadership, the servant leadership. And Haley Farm, we bought Alex Haley's farm, and we've been training thousands of young people down there to run freedom schools, to go into teaching, not go into law school. I've been trying to keep everybody out of law school, all different. We don't need more lawyers. We need, unless they're going to be public interest lawyers. But the point is, it's a very complicated policy process in this country. It's a very complicated political process. And you got to follow it through from the federal, state, and local level and the community level. But you have to train people in a new way of doing things. And we've been focused at Haley Farm on servant leadership, not self-serving leadership. And how do you build bridges between those folk who have most need and those folk who have too much? and who are not sharing it because we haven't had the policies in place to create a more fair society. And so this is an ongoing struggle, but you've got to have folk on the ground. You got to have the faith community and young people and women, okay, and people of color who are most affected and who are dispossessed involved in that so that their voices are heard. And this is a whole thing. But you know, we've got 36 major laws on the books. Disabled children are able to go to school, things that people said couldn't happen. You just have to keep pushing because it's the right thing to do. And secondly, pay attention to the budget process and say how much cheaper it is to invest preventatively in children than to wait until they get sick or it's too late to do something about them. You put them in jail, and why are we paying 3 to 4 or 5 times more to jail them up rather than give them prenatal care or to give them good quality child care? So we've got a lot of laws on the book because he talked about the money savings from raising healthy children. And so I think, and I love the fact that now there's the child advocacy movement has grown. We need to sort of cooperate a lot more and focus a lot more. But I think you just have to stay at it at all levels.
Thank you, Mrs. Edelman. So we have about 20 minutes left, and as I said, I want to ask a number of the questions that have been coming in from the audience, including some great ones here. Before I go to them, I'll just note for our speakers' benefit that we've had a really active chat going that you don't need to worry about, but just that there is so many connections to what you've been talking about. First, there's a serious HBCU contingent here today. They were expressing their pride as you were talking, Mrs. Edelman, about Spelman and Morehouse. There are many folks who've had experiences related to the Freedom Schools. Dr. Wilson, the way you started with just the focus on one child, I wanted to share that the way we started off our day was asking everybody to share in the chat, what is the name of a child who you do this work for, a child or a young person? So absolutely keeping that child at the center while also thinking about those budget issues and those technical, complicated operational issues that are how we do this work. So with that, one question that I want to ask is that's very popular from our audience is, do you think the events of 2020 have truly changed white Americans' commitment to real change, or was this just another moment of outrage without action? So again, the question is, do you think the events of 2020 have truly changed white Americans' commitment to real change, or was this just another moment of outrage without action? And I'll just add to that sort of, what do you think it would take to make sure that this is not just a moment, but truly is part of a movement for real change with white people, in addition to people of color within it? Either of you, if you would like to start with
that. I will defer to your wisdom on this first.
Yeah, I think, we have to be thoughtful about base building in the context of movement building. Once people are activated, they need an organizational container. They need a place to go to hold them accountable to ongoing action. And so some of the answers to the question is how many folks were activated versus how many folks found a home somewhere. And I think part of what we've got to do in the interest of social change long-term is to continue to build homes for people that once they get activated, that they can begin to act within a community of accountability to transform things, quite frankly, the things that are closest to them. Social change will happen at a local level before it happens at a national level. And so in as much as we begin to find these realities, when I talk to people the last 5 years, when to ask about our work in Ferguson or with the commission or in the uprising, so what can we do where we are? How can we help the movement? My answer was always find your Ferguson. What is the thing closest to you where it could blow up next? That's one. The other thing I'd say is that the test of this moment, let us be very clear, normal was not working well for Black and brown people. Normal was killing 18-year-old boys and girls in the street. Going back to normal as something being affirmed, and for the record, that killing did not stop on its pace during the pandemic. Just as many Black and brown people were killed by police, just as much community violence was happening in the context of the pandemic as was happening before. So that's still 2020 for you, while poverty increased, while exposure to domestic violence increased, and while inequities increased. So what we have to be careful about is what Dr. King talks about and why we can't wait. When he looked back on 1963, and when he was writing in that final chapter, he began to warn about gradualism and moderation. I think the coming test, even as we transition after the horrendous nature of the last week and a half to a new administration next week, is whether we will accept going back to what we called normal as success for an incoming administration. If we will fall into the trap of what Dr. King laid out as he talked about what he called, quote, the revolution of 1963. Will we follow the revolution of 2020 with gradualism and moderation? Because if we will allow that at the highest levels of government, if we will not push those who are supposed to be our friends to be much more aggressive in radical transformation, if quite frankly, we don't in this moment of deep depression and degradation in America swing for New Deal era transformation in policy, then we're just trying to go back to normal. And normal was killing my kin. And so we've got to continue to push. And I think, quite frankly, the coming days and what we accept will be more of a test of how we sustain this than what have been the last few moments and days.
I think we've also pushed by paying attention to the budget process. It makes sense to invest preventively, to save money, to build healthy children who can work productively and make our country stronger for all of us. And I think we've been able to get a lot of laws on the books because we talk about the cost of not investing preventively, the cost of not investing in early childhood education, the cost of not getting early childhood care. Child health care. We've been able to get 20, 25 laws on the books because of the budget arguments. It's cheaper to invest in children early on, to make them healthy and productive, to work for you, and to make our country more viable. And so we always appeal to self-interest. We can't sort of appeal to decency and morality. And so you've got to have a variety of things. And there are no general coalitions for children. There are no general coalitions for many things, other than the racists and for the people who are the haters. And you have to sort of, so, you know, we've got 2-3 dozen laws on the books that have helped handicapped children, disabled children get, there are 3 dozen laws on the books that are really core things. And we also understood that whoever controls the money controls the policy. And so really understanding the nitty gritty dull stuff of the budget process is where the core is. And then you got to train people in sort of understanding that once you get yours, you have to share, because there's no safety here if you can't sort of make sure that everybody has a place at the table in the long term. And the files are values of who we say we want to be. And so I just have to keep at it. And happily, I hope we're going to be in a new era. We're going to have a nasty spate here that we have to go through. Trumpism has to go away, but it was still alive. And it reared its ugly head again. And capitalism needs to be reformed in some basic way. Because what we've seen is the implosion of American capitalism. We have got to create a concept of enough for everybody. There needs not be all these folk at the top who have too much and people at the bottom who are many, 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 many more people who don't have enough. And so I'm hoping that some way we will come to a level of morality and decency that says that we can have enough for everybody. And for those who are exceptionally brilliant, exceptionally working, whatever, but no child should not have a level playing field upon which to try to begin to succeed in this rich nation.
Absolutely. Mrs. Edelman, one question we got that's directed to you, but I would love to hear both of you on it, is the question is, what is the most important lesson we can teach our Black and brown children today? And what can we teach all children?
We should teach every child that they're sacred and that they're no better than any other child, okay? And our institutions should reflect that in the way they structure themselves, in the way in which they serve all children. No child should be left behind in this country, okay? And not have their basic needs felt. We should not have child poverty. There should not be over 12 million children who are poor, many living in extreme poverty. This is just, and I don't understand if you got 1 billion where you got to have 5 or 10 or 20, and I wouldn't deny that if we had no poor children, okay? And no children who were homeless and no children who weren't getting their very basic needs met. So we just need to come to grips with what does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean to be an American? What does the United States of America mean? but no child should be left behind. And every child in this nation can get a healthy start and a head start, a fair start, the things that are in our mission statement, and successful transition to adulthood, which will make us all a better, richer nation, but also a more decent nation and a more just nation. And that should be our aspiration.
Amen to all of that. In light of the last week, I'd say a couple of things. Number one, I think all young people should be told, taught, and understand that America is just an idea and that it has never been. America never was America to me. This idea of what happened last week being an attack on a thing that is, it was an attack on a concept. And so, as I've said in other settings, what we experienced last week for young people was the end of innocence about the idea of America. And so if you're an American child, you should understand and appreciate that the idea that you have been born into has to be contested for, and that you have the responsibility to engage in that struggle. And so one of the great corrections of one of my mentors on me was I was making a public statement and talked about how I struggle so my children don't have to. And he said, if you as a Black man in America are struggling so your children don't have to, you are setting your children up for failure. You need to help them to understand that you will struggle and you will hand the struggle to them. And so all children in America should understand that the struggle to become the idea of America is a struggle that they will inherit, because the ideas and the symbols of what that America is, things like the peaceful transfer of power, are not to be accepted as if they will always be. We must continue to struggle for them. The other thing that every child should understand, every single child on the globe, especially those impacted by Western postmodern notions, should understand is that people of color are the global majority. People of color are the global majority. The frames we have used around minority and majority in America have been harmful to white people, and they've been harmful to people of color. As I said to a group of teachers, educators in Webster Groves Independent School District there outside of St. Louis, just days after the Charlottesville uprising and riots, I told them that part of what was happening, someone asked me the question, we were talking about the pedagogy of freedom schools, talking about our partnership with them to have culturally competent education for young people. And they said, well, what will you have us to teach our white students? Because the district was majority white. I was talking to every educator in the district. I said, you need to tell them, you need to teach them, you need to show them. They need books that show people of color as the majority, because part of what you see in Charlottesville and part of what we saw last week in the Capitol is people who were shocked into the fact that they actually were not the majority. They haven't been for a long time. They haven't been in most of their lifetimes, but their narrow frame on the world had them believing that they should be in charge because it was a democracy and they were the majority, and they haven't been. All children need to understand that people of color are of the global majority. They live in a global world. It will help to reset this unfortunate Western hierarchy of human value that has placed white people on top. And it will enforce the agency, the thoughtfulness, the confidence of these children of color who are now the majority of America. And so all children should know they've got to contest for the idea of America, and all children should know that people of color are people of the global majority, so that they don't get caught up in these notions that they have to be shocked back from and have the kind of negative, violent impulses that we saw last week.
I think you've already started to address this next question, but it's by far the one that's had the most votes, so I want to be sure to ask it and honor our audience. Our audience is asking, what is the one policy or issue that you'd recommend our education reform movement prioritize in 2021? Is there something beyond what you've been sharing already about what we need to teach our children? Is there one policy or issue that you'd recommend our education reform movement prioritize this year?
Children don't come in pieces. And policy should be approached in a holistic way. I would not say I want to do nutrition and not leave my children without health, have my children get health care, or to say that they won't get early childhood care that's quality, or to say that they don't have equal educational opportunities. And you won't say that this invest in early childhood, which I think we should, but you don't let them go when they're in 6th grade or in 9th grade or in 12th grade. You've got to look at the whole child and the trajectory of investment throughout the beginning, and good policy should mirror what every good parent wants for their own child, because our children have to live with other people's children. And so I just think that I don't like to choose between this. Every child wants health care, needs health care. Every child needs to be getting a quality early childhood. Every child needs an equal education that is equally financed. Every child needs to not be discriminated against because of the color of their skin or because they were born with some kind of disability. I mean, God did not make two classes of children, and we can continue to try to do that. And to treat them unequally at our own peril is wrong. And so I think that, listen, we need to get our act together. We know enough, and we've been emphasizing the fact that it's cheaper to build healthy children than to try to keep them in prison later on or to deal with them after the disabilities become serious. So if you don't like these children, or you want to label them off as somehow not equal to you, you ought to do it because it's cost effective. To invest in them all and to make them all grow up to contribute and to feel a part of the community, and not have them shooting at you because they've been excluded from everything.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say, this doesn't, again, I'm a student of Mrs. Edelman, so I'll try to be a good student in this way, because it fits with that frame that children don't come in pieces. I want to offer something that may not feel like it's in the wheelhouse of education reform. By simply saying that money matters.
Money matters.
Money matters. And so, yes, we need to look at the budget of the school district, and we need to look at the budget of the state legislature. We need to look at the budget of the federal government. But if we just put some more money into these households, the kids will do better in your schools. And so we actually need to be thoughtful about one of the things that happened last year very quietly in the midst of conversation about COVID relief was, for the first time in our history in Congress, we had a majority of one caucus to actually sign on for child allowances. This idea that if you have a child, you should actually get some subsidy just because there is a child. Most English-speaking first world nations already do this. We are the only ones who don't. And in the last COVID package, we finally saw that COVID relief for children matched the COVID relief that went to adults. And so we know that putting money into households, we know because of tests that the Ford Foundation and administrators in Oklahoma and the state of Oklahoma did with child development accounts, that if you just put more resources into a family household, that kids do better in school, they're more healthy, we know by tests with universal basic income in places like Stockton, California, a city most recently led by a young man who was raised at Alex Haley Farm. Right? So we know that these things work for education. So I invite education reform folks, I invite child advocates to be engaged in the fight around wages and around wealth building strategies to increase the minimum wage across the country to at least $15 an hour. Quite frankly, we've been saying that long enough and we've not done it yet to the degree that is now outmoded, right? We actually need more than that. I remind people, again, I'll go back to civil rights era. If we took the sanitation workers who King was standing with in Memphis and we adjusted their salary by their wages for inflation all over the course until today, they would be making $19 an hour, and they were making less than $2 an hour then, right? And we're talking about people who were striking for human dignity at the time. So I encourage education workers, education reformers to engage in the dialogue about increasing the minimum wage. I encourage them to engage in the dialogue about child allowances. I encourage them to engage in the dialogue about the child tax credit that is now being debated even as we speak, and maybe even negotiated, that putting more resources in the household through wages, through wealth building supports like community development accounts, like child development accounts, like individual development accounts, like college savings accounts, are the things that will make a difference in education generally. It's not just about the system. Sometimes it's actually just about resources to families. Money matters.
Thank you. Thank you for that reminder. So my last question to both of you is, how do you stay motivated when the struggle for justice is so slow and long? What personally gives you strength? What helps you stay motivated?
Preacher, you want to say something more?
The preacher always wants to say something more. So I'll just say energy from young people. I mean, that actually, when we talked about seeing the image of a young person who makes your heart leap, that actually is a devotional practice for me. So that is a regular ritual for me. But also just, I rock with young people, right? So, you just got to, part of the joy for me in the Ferguson Uprising is I got introduced to a whole lot of young people that I get to pour into and who get to push me on things. And that gives me energy. When I don't, when I won't do it for anybody else, I do it for Carissa and I'll do it for Kayla and I'll do it, so they're rocking and they're pushing me. And so that gives me energy.
I just have a rock bottom belief that I was taught in my childhood by my minister father and my mother, who was the best organizer I've ever known, that God did not make two classes of children. And that every child was sacred and every child was entitled to have what every other child could gain by the systems that we were growing up under. And if you didn't like the way things were, you changed them. And so I really just believe that every child is sacred. And inequalities that are imposed based on race or disability or language or anything, it's just unacceptable in a decent society. And so I think it's been a privilege to focus in on children and preventive investment. And we've made more progress by saying it's cheaper to invest in children before they get sick, before they drop out of school, before they get into trouble. And why do you want to pay 3 to 4 times more to imprison them than to give them early childhood that's of high quality? And so I think that you try every possible tactics, but if we're going to be a United States of America, and I've always been confused about that, in God we trust on our currency, because does it mean the currency is the God, or what is the God here? But for those of us who are people of faith, I think that we're called upon to make sure that no child is left behind. And no person in this rich nation does not have a fair opportunity to succeed and to live in a decent way. And so I think it's a privilege to do what we do.
Yes. No, thank you for that reminder, Mrs. Edelman, that it is a privilege to do what we do. Just as one last word, you were telling me this in our virtual green room before we started. Would you tell our audience about the necklace that you're wearing and just that tangible reminder that can help us stay strong?
I carry my ladies around my neck, okay? I carry Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. And when I think I'm having a hard day, I just rub my ladies, because we don't know from hard. And we have such an extraordinary legacy of courage, of people who overcame odds that we don't have any sense of being able to do today. And so the legacy of struggle in this country to make all of us free, but to break down slavery and second-class treatment of women and those with disabilities or whatever. God did not make two classes of children or two classes of people. And it is just time for us to come to our senses and to recognize that we're all one under God. And that our obligation as we're sort of being here on this earth is to make and leave it better than we found it. And so it's been a privilege to do this work. And I thought as well, not only is this the right thing to do, but boy, you say if you save money, if you make sure that every child gets that preventive immunization and health care and early childhood and good education. And so we've been able to get a lot by appealing to people's self-interest, because you're going to pay for it in prison. Why do you want to pay 3 to 4 times to imprison people when you could have given them that money in prenatal care and early childhood child care and good education? And so I think we're going to get there, okay? But we have to keep pushing. Change does not happen without organizing, without voice, without the faith community and women and young people getting out there and insisting that change happens. And we've got a lot of laws on the books that wouldn't have been there. And we continue to pay attention to the budget process, because whoever controls the budget controls the policy. And so we just have to be very effective advocates and never give up and be monitoring every minute of the day.
Mrs. Edelman and Dr. Wilson, I have to share with you just a couple of comments from the chat because they sum up, I think, our audience's reactions better than I could. One person has said it's been a privilege to be on this Zoom, which is not something that you hear very often, and that is very much because of both of you. We've heard people say what a gift it is this afternoon has been, and just that this could not have come at a better time. What a call to action for our community. Such an amazing opportunity to be part of this conversation with two world changers. So just please know this conversation has truly been a gift for our group of education leaders. And I ask all of you to join me in just the heartiest of virtual applause for these incredible leaders. We're truly blessed to have gotten to spend this time with you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.